Dorothy Hale was the only person in the building who knew it was going to fall down. She was also the only person nobody would believe. She had known for exactly 1 year, 4 months, and 11 days, not because she counted obsessively, but because the date was written at the top of a report she had typed herself, printed on the school's ancient inkjet, and carried to the principal's office on a Tuesday morning before the breakfast rush. She remembered the date the way you remember the date of something that should have mattered and didn't. Now it was a Thursday in May, and the gymnasium, the old one, the one built in 1968, the one with the crack running along the east foundation wall like a thin gray river, was being filled with 300 folding chairs for the spring assembly. Dorothy stood in the cafeteria kitchen with a serving spoon in her hand and watched the custodians wheel the chairs past the service window, one stack after another, toward a room she had told Renata Voss should not hold more than 30 people at a time. Nobody had asked her opinion. Nobody ever did. She wore a hairnet and an apron with a faded coffee stain near the hem, and to the people who ran Lindgren Elementary, that was the entirety of what she was. She had not always worn an apron. 12 years ago, her name had been on stamped drawings. 12 years ago, men in hard hats had called her ma'am and meant it as respect. None of that was written anywhere a person could see now. It lived only in her hands. In the particular way she still noticed things, the way a building breathed, the way weight moved through concrete, the way water moves through a riverbed, finding the weakest path first. Every day at 12:15, while the children ate lunch under the watch of 2 aides, Dorothy walked down to the boiler room beneath the old gym. It was not part of her job. Nobody had asked her to do it. She did it anyway, the way some people check a lock twice before bed, not because they expect a burglar, but because the checking itself had become the only way she knew how to sleep at night. She had been doing it for 13 months. Today, when she pressed her palm flat against the foundation wall the way she always did, she felt something new, a tremor. Small. Almost nothing. The kind of thing most people would never notice with their hand, and that was exactly the problem. Most people would never put their hand there at all. She stood very still in the dim light of the boiler room, her palm against the cold concrete, and she did not move for almost a full minute. Then she went looking for Felix Pratt. She found him in the gym itself, taping down extension cords for the sound system, his whistle still hanging from his neck from the last period's class. Felix Pratt was 26 years old and had been teaching physical education at Lindgren for 2 years on a contract that got renewed every August with no guarantee attached to it. He liked Dorothy. He was one of the few adults in the building who said good morning to her by name instead of by function. "Dorothy," he said, glancing up, "you look like you saw a ghost." "Not a ghost," she said. "Just an old friend I was hoping wouldn't show up again." He didn't understand the joke, because it wasn't really one, and something in her voice made him set down the tape. She told him about the wall. Not loudly, not dramatically. She told him the way she had learned to tell people things in this building carefully, like she was apologizing in advance for having an opinion. Felix listened with his arms crossed, his weight shifting from one foot to the other, and Dorothy watched something move behind his eyes that looked almost like belief. "You should tell Voss," he said. "I did tell Voss," Dorothy said, "a year ago, in writing." Felix's mouth opened slightly. He didn't ask what had happened. He already knew, the way everyone in the building knew certain things without ever saying them out loud, that Renata Voss did not like to be told her building had a problem she hadn't already solved. 300 chairs were already set up. Parents would start arriving in 2 hours. Dorothy walked to the front office anyway, because walking away and saying nothing was a thing she had done once before, a long time ago, and it had cost her more than this building was worth. Renata Voss was behind her desk when Dorothy knocked. A stack of programs for the assembly fanned out in front of her like a hand of cards she was proud of. She looked up, and something in her face, not quite a flinch, but close to one, told Dorothy that some part of Renata had been waiting for this conversation for 13 months and dreading it the entire time. "Dorothy," Renata said, "I'm a little busy." "I won't take long." Dorothy kept her voice even. She had learned that calm carried further than urgency ever did, especially when the person across the desk had already decided not to listen. The east wall under the gym. I felt movement today. More than before. Renata's pen stopped moving. For a moment, just a moment, something flickered across her face that looked almost like fear. Then it closed. The way a door closes when someone decides on purpose not to walk through it. The inspection cleared that wall 2 years ago, Renata said. The inspection was done before the new wing's foundation work next door, Dorothy said. Vibration travels. I wrote that in the report. I read the report. Renata's voice had gone flat now, controlled in the particular way of someone working very hard to sound unbothered. Dorothy, I appreciate that you have a background. I do. But we have engineers on contract for exactly this reason, and they signed off. They signed off on paper, Dorothy said. I'm telling you what I felt with my hand an hour ago. The two women looked at each other across the desk, and there was a long pause that neither of them filled because both of them understood that whatever happened next could not be taken back. Renata picked her pen back up. The assembly starts at 2, she said, not looking up again. Thank you, Dorothy. Dorothy stood there one more second. Then she turned and walked back toward the kitchen, past the stack of programs, past the gymnasium doors propped open with rubber wedges, past 300 empty chairs waiting to be filled. Felix was still in the gym when she passed through it. He caught her eye and didn't say anything, and in his silence she recognized something she had seen in 100 other people, over 100 other years. The particular look of a man who almost said something and chose, one more time, not to. By 1 o'clock, the parking lot outside Lindgren Elementary was already filling with cars, and Dorothy Hale stood at the kitchen's service window, watching them arrive the way a person watches weather. They cannot stop. She had tried twice now. She understood, standing there with a tray of apple slices going soft in front of her, that she was not going to get a third chance before 2 o'clock, and that whatever she did next would have to be different from a report nobody read and a conversation nobody wanted. She found Renata again at 1:30, this time in the hallway outside the gym, clipboard in hand, counting folding chairs against a number that existed only in her head. Dorothy didn't ask to speak privately. She didn't have time for privacy anymore. Renata. She kept her voice low, just between the two of them, even as teachers and aides moved past in both directions. I'm not asking you to cancel the assembly. I'm asking you to move it to the cafeteria. We have the space. It would cost you an hour, maybe less. Renata's jaw tightened, the smallest motion, the kind most people wouldn't have caught. Dorothy caught it. She had spent 30 years learning to read stress in materials, and stress in a person's face was not so different once you knew where to look. Do you know what it took to get the bond measure passed for this building's renovation? Renata said. Her voice stayed quiet too, but something underneath it had gone hard. 3 years, 2 failed votes. I put my name on that project in front of the school board, in front of the superintendent, in front of every parent in this district. If I stand up today and say the gym my administration certified as safe might not be safe, do you understand what that does? Not to me. To the next bond measure. To the roof we still need to replace. To the 4 portables we're trying to get rid of. I understand it costs you something, Dorothy said. I'm telling you what it might cost someone else. Renata's eyes moved away from her, down the hallway, toward the gym doors. For 1 second, one single second, Dorothy watched something almost give way in her. Then it didn't. The wall passed inspection, Renata said again. The way a person repeats a thing they need to be true. I have to trust the people whose job it is to know that. Not, she stopped herself before she finished the sentence, but Dorothy finished it for her in her own head anyway. Not you. Fine, Dorothy said, and walked away, because there was nothing left in that hallway worth standing in. She found Felix in the equipment closet behind the gym, coiling a volleyball net that didn't need coiling, his hands working at something to keep from standing still. She told him what Renata had said. He listened with his back against the shelving, his jaw working slightly, the whistle still around his neck like he'd forgotten it was there. I could say something, he said. At the staff meeting last week, when Voss brought up the assembly setup, I almost did. I had it right there. He tapped 2 fingers against his own chest. I've got 11 months left on a 2-year contract, Dorothy. Renewal's in August. You know how renewal works here. It's not a form. It's a conversation, and it's her conversation to have. I know how it works, Dorothy said, and she did. She had learned, over 13 months of being right and unheard, exactly how the weight of a paycheck could sit on top of a person's voice until the voice stopped finding its way out. She didn't say it with anger. She had no room left for anger. What she had instead was a tired, practical understanding of why good people stayed quiet, because she had been a quiet person once herself, a long time ago, in a different building, with a different set of drawings, and the silence then had cost more than any silence ever should. "What if I'm right?" Felix said. "Not quite a question, and we don't say anything." "Then it falls down anyway," Dorothy said. "Whether or not we said something." Felix looked at her for a long moment. Outside the equipment closet, she could hear chairs scraping against the gym floor as the last rows were squared away. Hear the murmur of parents starting to file in through the side doors. Hear, somewhere closer, a child's voice asking another child if the assembly had snacks. "I'll watch the wall during the program," Felix said finally, "from the side, near the equipment door. If anything looks wrong, I'll back you up. That much I can do." It wasn't agreement, it wasn't a guarantee, but it was more than Dorothy had gotten from anyone else in 13 months, and she nodded once. The way you nod at a small kindness you've stopped. She went back to the kitchen because lunch service wasn't finished and because standing still made the... At the serving line, a girl in a yellow cardigan held out her tray, 3rd grade. The same girl who came through every day with the same quiet, careful manners, the same please and thank you that most 10-year-olds had stopped bothering with. "Can I have extra rice, Miss Dorothy?" Mia asked. Dorothy looked at her for a second longer than the question required. Mia's family had moved into the district 8 months ago. Her father worked nights, and Dorothy had noticed early on that the girl ate like food wasn't something she could always count on. Dorothy had been adding an extra scoop to her tray ever since, without comment, without anyone else noticing, the same way she'd checked the boiler room every day without anyone asking her to. "Of course you can," Dorothy said, and gave her 2 scoops instead of 1. Mia smiled, a small, easy thing, and moved down the line toward the gym doors, toward the assembly, toward 300 folding chairs, and a wall that Dorothy had run out of ways to warn anyone about. Dorothy watched her go. Then she set down the serving spoon, untied her apron halfway, and decided that whatever else happened in the next hour, she was not going to be standing behind a kitchen counter when it did. By 2 o'clock, the old gymnasium at Lindgren Elementary held 280 parents, 44th and 5th graders seated cross-legged at the front for the spring choir performance, and one woman standing at the back near the equipment door who had not been assigned a seat and had not asked for one. Dorothy stood with her back almost against the cinder block wall, close enough to the boiler room stairwell that she could feel, faintly, through the soles of her shoes, the particular hum of old machinery doing what it had always done. She had taken off her hairnet. She had not taken off her apron. Nobody in the room looked at her twice, which was, as it had always been, exactly the point and exactly the problem. Renata Voss stood at the small podium near the stage, welcoming everyone in the bright, practiced voice of a woman who had given this exact speech in some form every spring for 6 years. She thanked the PTA. She thanked the music teacher. She mentioned, briefly, proudly, the renovation work that had brought new paint and new flooring to the building over the past 3 years, and a small ripple of applause moved through the parents, and Dorothy watched Renata's shoulders settle half an inch. The visible relief of a person standing on ground she still believed was solid. The choir began. 40 children's voices, slightly off-key in the way that always made parents smile rather than wince, filled the gym with a song about springtime that Dorothy had heard rehearsed through the cafeteria walls for 2 weeks straight. She kept her hand near the wall. She did not know exactly what she was waiting for. She only knew that she would feel it before anyone else in the room did, the way she had felt it that morning, the way she had felt it 13 months ago when she first wrote it down, a fact in her hands before it became a fact anyone else could see. It came during the 2nd verse. It was not loud. That was what made it almost impossible to catch not a crack, not a groan, but a fine, high sound, like a tooth being drawn slowly across glass, somewhere above the east wall near the roofline. A scatter of dust drifted down from a ceiling tile and caught the light from the high windows, turning gold for a second before it settled on the shoulders of two parents in the third row who didn't even look up. Dorothy's whole body went still in a different way than waiting. She had spent 30 years learning the difference between a building settling and a building failing, and this was not settling. She moved toward the side aisle, fast, weaving past folding chairs, and found Felix already turning from his post near the equipment door, his eyes already on the same patch of ceiling hers were. "You felt that," she said, not a question. "I heard it," he said. There was no time to find Renata through a crowd of 300 people. Dorothy did not try. She walked instead toward the front of the room, toward the small podium, toward the choir still singing, and she did the only thing she had left, which was the thing she had spent 13 months being too careful to do. She raised her voice. "Everyone needs to leave the gym. Now. Through the side doors, not the front." The choir faltered, then stopped. 300 faces turned toward a woman in a stained apron, standing in the middle of the aisle, and for one full second, nobody moved, because nothing about her, her clothes, her position, the spoon-shaped dent worn into the fabric at her hip, told them she was someone whose word should empty a room. Renata's voice came sharp from the podium. "Dorothy." "The east wall is failing," Dorothy said. Louder now, not at Renata, not at anyone in particular, but at the room itself, at every parent frozen in a folding chair trying to decide whether this was an emergency or an embarrassment. "I need everyone to move toward the side exits. Right now. Please." A man near the back stood up first, slowly, the way you stand up when you're not sure you should, but you'd rather be wrong on your feet than wrong in your seat. Then a few more. Most people did not move. Most people looked instead toward Renata, toward the podium, toward the person whose job it was, supposedly, to tell them whether something was wrong. Renata stood frozen for half a second too long. It was Mia who moved first among the children. She was seated near the front with the rest of her class, and she had heard the same sound Dorothy heard, the same dust falling, and she did not wait to be told twice. She grabbed the sleeve of the boy next to her and pulled him up, and said, in a voice loud enough to carry over the murmuring crowd, Miss Dorothy said go, with the flat, absolute certainty of a child who had decided, 8 months ago, over an extra scoop of rice given without comment, that this particular adult could be trusted completely. It was a small thing, a girl pulling a boy to his feet, but it moved through the room the way a single loose stone starts a slide. 3 more children stood, then their parents, then the row behind them, until what had been confusion became motion, became 300 people converging on 2 side exits at once, controlled but quickening, the particular hush-then-rush of people deciding, almost all together, to believe. Felix was already at the equipment door, propping it fully open, waving children through with both arms, calling out class names to keep groups together the way he did during fire drills. Mrs. Albright's class, this way. Keep moving, you're doing great. Renata came down off the podium stage at last, her clipboard forgotten somewhere behind her, moving toward the front rows where the youngest children sat, helping kindergartners to their feet with hands that were not quite steady. The sound came again, louder this time. Not a tooth on glass now, but something closer to a low groan, deep in the structure, the sound of weight finding, finally, after 13 months of small movements, the path it had been looking for. Faster, Dorothy said, not shouting, but pitched to cut through the noise, standing near the center aisle, counting heads the way she had once counted load paths on a set of drawings, refusing to move toward the door herself until she could see the back rows empty. Eyes up, away from the east wall. Keep moving. A woman near her stumbled over a folding chair leg and went down hard on one knee, and Dorothy was there before she finished falling, hand under the woman's arm, pulling her up and forward in the same motion, no pause in it at all, the kind of motion a body only has if some part of it has done this before, in some other building, under some other roof, when there had been no time to be gentle about being right. The last of the children went through the side door. Felix counted them out loud as they passed, his voice steady even as his eyes kept cutting up toward the ceiling near the east wall. Renata came last among the staff, ushering a teacher's aide ahead of her, looking back once over her shoulder at the gym behind them, at the folding chairs, at the small stage, at the wall she had stood beside 100 times and never once put her hand against. Dorothy was the last one through the door. She stepped out into the bright afternoon light of the side lawn, into a crowd of 300 people standing in stunned, shifting silence, children clutching parents' hands, teachers doing head counts against class rosters pulled from back pockets, and she turned around in time to hear it happen. It was not a collapse, not the way a movie would have shown it. It was a section perhaps 15 feet of the east wall near the roofline, the exact stretch Dorothy had pressed her palm against that morning, folding inward, with a sound like a held breath finally let go, a slow, heavy crumple of block and beam and ceiling tile, collapsing down into the space where, 4 minutes earlier, 300 people had been sitting in folding chairs, listening to children sing about spring. Dust rolled out through the propped-open equipment door in a gray cloud that caught the afternoon sun. Nobody on the lawn screamed. There was, instead, a silence of a particular kind, the silence of 300 people understanding, all at once, exactly how close they had come and exactly whose voice had moved them before they understood why. Mia found Dorothy in the crowd and pressed herself against her side without a word, and Dorothy put a hand on the girl's shoulder, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, because there was nothing yet that needed saying. Across the lawn, Renata Voss stood very still, looking back at the building, at the gray cloud still drifting from the open door, and Dorothy watched her hands clipboard gone, fingers empty begin, very slightly, to shake. The fire department arrived 9 minutes after the collapse, followed by 2 police cruisers, followed, within the hour, by a man from the district office who introduced himself to no one in particular and spent 40 minutes walking the perimeter of the building with a clipboard of his own, taking photographs of a hole in the gymnasium wall that had not existed that morning. Dorothy sat on the curb near the bus loop with a paper cup of water someone had pressed into her hands. Mia still beside her, the girls' class eventually peeled away by a teacher doing a final head count, leaving Dorothy alone for the first time since the chairs had scattered. It was Felix who found her there. He sat down on the curb without asking, his whistle still around his neck, his hands not quite steady either, now that there was nothing left to direct. "I'm going to the district office tomorrow," he said. "Whatever happens with my contract happens. I should have said something 3 weeks ago. When you told me about the report the first time, I knew. I just let it be your problem instead of mine." Dorothy didn't answer right away. She was looking at the building, at the gray dust, still settling near the broken wall, at the place where 300 folding chairs had been. "You backed me up today," she said, "when it mattered. That's not nothing, Felix." "It's not enough either," he said, and she didn't argue with him, because she understood the particular shame of having almost done the right thing in time to matter, and she had no comfort to offer him that wouldn't have been a lie. The emergency school board session was called for 7 that evening, in the district office conference room 2 miles away, and word of it moved through the parking lot, the way news moves through. People who have just survived something together fast, certain, unwilling to wait for an official channel. Dorothy was not invited. She went anyway, walking in behind a small cluster of parents who had decided the same thing, and found a seat near the back of a room that filled faster than anyone on the board seemed to have expected. Walter Cobb, the board's longest-serving member, a heavy-set man with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair, opened the session by asking, simply, what had happened, and why a structural failure had occurred in a building that had passed inspection 2 years prior. It was Felix who stood first, before anyone called on him, before he'd fully decided to. He walked to the front of the room, still in his gym clothes from that afternoon, and he told them, plainly, without performance, that a kitchen staff member named Dorothy Hale had submitted a written report 13 months earlier warning about exactly this wall, and that he had personal knowledge the report had been received and set aside. A murmur moved through the room. Walter Cobb turned toward Renata Voss, seated at the staff table near the front. her hands folded in front of her with the careful stillness of someone trying very hard not to be seen shaking. "Is that true?" Cobb asked her directly. Renata didn't answer immediately. Dorothy watched her take a breath. The kind of breath a person takes before deciding whether to keep building the version of events they've been living inside, or to finally step outside of it. "I have the report," Renata said quietly. "It's in my office, in a drawer." She paused. "I read it when she gave it to me. I read it again twice after that, actually, on nights I couldn't tell you why I was thinking about it. I told myself the contracted inspection superseded it. I told myself that because the alternative was reopening a capital project, I had already told this board, and every parent in that district was finished and safe." She looked up, not at Cobb, but past him, toward the back of the room, until she found Dorothy. "I was wrong. Not about the engineering. I never had standing to be wrong or right about the engineering. I was wrong about whose word counted enough to act on." Nobody in the room spoke for a moment. Dorothy held Renata's gaze across the distance between them, and there was no triumph in it for her, no satisfaction in finally being the one in the room who had been right, only a tired, heavy recognition of a thing she had known her whole working life and had hoped for 13 months might somehow not be true here. Cobb asked Dorothy to come to the front. She did, slowly, aware of every eye in the room following her. Aware that 12 years ago she would have walked to a podium like this in a blazer instead of an apron, and nobody would have needed convincing first. "You used to be an engineer," Cobb said. "It wasn't quite a question." "I was a structural engineer for 19 years, Dorothy said. "I left the field 8 years ago." "Why?" She had not planned to answer that question in a room full of strangers. But something about the day, about the dust still in her hair, about Mia's hand that had found hers on the lawn without being asked, about 13 months of being unheard, finally cracking open into a room where people were, for once, listening made her answer it anyway. "My son was an intern on a bridge project," she said. "A firm I'd consulted for years before used a load calculation I had flagged as insufficient in an earlier review. I wasn't the engineer of record on that job. I raised the concern through the proper channel and was told the senior engineer had already accounted for it. I let it go because raising it twice felt like overstepping." Her voice did not shake, though something in her chest had gone very still and very careful. The way it always did when she made herself say this out loud, which she did rarely and never easily. The bridge held for 2 years. Then a service walkway section failed during a routine inspection my son was assisting on. He was the only person on the walkway. I have spent every year since this happened understanding that I knew something, and let someone else's authority outrank what I knew, and it cost me the only thing I would never get back. The room was completely silent. "I didn't go to a kitchen because I stopped being an engineer," she said. "I went to a kitchen because I needed a job where, if I said something was wrong and nobody listened, the worst thing that could happen was a child went home hungry. I could live with that kind of wrong. I thought I could anyway." She looked at Cobb, then let her eyes move once more across the room, past Renata, toward the back where Felix and a handful of parents stood watching her. "I was wrong about that too. There's no job small enough that being unheard doesn't eventually cost something." The board session ended a little after 9 that night, but its consequences took most of the summer to settle, the way real consequences usually do not in a single dramatic motion, but in the slow, unglamorous work of paperwork, hearings, and decisions made in rooms far smaller than the one where the truth had finally come out. Renata Voss resigned 11 days later. She did not wait to be removed, and she did not frame it, in her letter to the board, as anything other than what it was. Dorothy heard about the resignation, the way she heard most things now through the cafeteria, through Felix, through the quiet network of people who had stood on that lawn together and never quite stopped checking in on each other afterward. She saw Renata once more before the woman cleared out her office, in the second week of June, the building still smelling faintly of dust and fresh plywood, where the east wall had been temporarily sealed off pending reconstruction. Dorothy found her in the front office on a Tuesday afternoon, packing a box of framed certificates and a small potted plant that had sat on her windowsill for 6 years. I owe you more than I know how to say, Renata said, not looking up from the box. Dorothy thought about all the things she could have said back about 13 months, about a report in a drawer, about 300 folding chairs. She found, standing there, that she didn't want to say any of them. You read it 3 times, Dorothy said instead. Most people wouldn't have read it once. That's not nothing, even if it wasn't enough. I hope wherever you go next, you let the second read change something the first time it happens, instead of the third. Renata's hands stilled over the box. She looked up, and something in her face loosened, just slightly, the way a person's face does when they've braced for one thing and received another. Thank you, she said, and that was all either of them needed it to be. Walter Cobb oversaw the district's response personally. The East Wing was rebuilt over the summer, properly this time, with an independent structural review that named Dorothy's original report as the basis for the new foundation work, not as a courtesy, but because the new engineers, reading 13-month-old numbers written by a woman who'd been wearing a hairnet when she wrote them, found nothing to improve upon and everything to confirm. The board offered her a paid consulting position on the reconstruction. She accepted that part. The board also offered her, more quietly, an opening for a full engineering role within the district's facilities department, the kind of job with a title and an office and a salary that would have looked, on paper, like everything that Bridge Project had once promised her and never delivered. She turned that part down. Felix kept his contract. Nobody at the district ever said so directly, but the renewal came through in July without the usual conversation, and Dorothy suspected that a man who had stood in front of a school board and told the truth, before he was asked to, had earned more job security than any conversation could have given him. By late August, the new gymnasium had its first coat of paint. The cafeteria kitchen had its windows reopened to the smell of the year's first lunch service, and Dorothy Hale stood behind the same serving line she had stood behind for 8 years, in the same apron, though this one was new, the old one having been quietly retired sometime during the summer without ceremony. What had changed was smaller than people might have expected, and that, she had come to understand, was usually how real change actually arrived, not in grand declarations, but in the small, permanent adjustments a place makes to itself once it has been forced, however briefly, to look directly at what it had been ignoring. There was a laminated card now, taped beside the boiler room door, listing emergency contact protocols and a maintenance check schedule that had not existed before. There was a standing line item in the monthly staff meeting structural concerns, open floor that the new interim principal had insisted on adding, and that for the first time in Dorothy's memory, nobody on staff treated as a formality to rush through. And on Thursday afternoons, after the lunch rush had cleared and the kitchen had gone quiet, Dorothy now spent 45 minutes in the school library with a rotating group of 8 or 9 students, mostly 4th and 5th graders, teaching them in language built for 10-year-olds, with cardboard models and rulers instead of load equations, why some buildings stood for 100 years and others didn't, why a single small crack mattered more than people wanted it to, why the strongest structures were the ones somebody kept checking on, quietly, even when nobody asked them to. Mia came every week. She sat in the front, the same seat each time, and asked more questions than anyone else in the room, and Dorothy answered every one of them the way she wished. Once, someone had answered hers. It was Mia who finally asked the question, on a Thursday in late September, the cardboard bridge model between them held together with masking tape and string. "Why don't you go back to being a real engineer?" she asked. "Like, for real, with an office and everything. You could. Everybody knows you could now." Dorothy looked at the model for a moment before she answered, at the small, careful joints the children had taped together that afternoon, at the way the structure held its own weight when you pressed down gently in the middle. "I am a real engineer," she said. "I just decided the most important structure I could spend my time on wasn't a building anymore." She nodded toward the library door, toward the cafeteria beyond it, toward the lunch line that would start filling again in 20 minutes. It's the kind of foundation you can't always see from the outside, the kind that holds up whether or not anybody signs off on it. Mia considered this with the particular seriousness of a child deciding whether an answer was good enough to stop asking about, and apparently decided it was because she went back to adjusting the masking tape on the bridge without another word. Dorothy watched her work. Outside the library window, late afternoon light moved across a courtyard where the new gym now stood, finished, solid, checked twice by people who had finally learned, however briefly, however imperfectly, to listen to the person whose hand had been on the wall the whole time. She picked up the serving spoon waiting on the counter, because the lunch line would start again soon, and there was, as there always was, an extra scoop of rice waiting for a girl who had once decided, over nothing more than that small kindness, that this particular woman's word could be trusted completely and had been right.